Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I was going to also thank the ACLU of Oregon for inviting me, but then they put me after Matt Bors, which is an incredibly unfair position to be for a speaker. If I'm ever going to come again, I get to go first, and then he goes next. Thank you, pre-recorded Glenn Greenwald, for that really nice introduction. I actually spoke to Glenn last week, and he said, the ACLU of Oregon asked me to record a video, and they said, they want me to talk about the last year, they want me to talk about the journalism, they want me to talk about the NSA, they want me to talk about Ed Snowden, they want me to talk about how great the ACLU of Oregon is, they want me to talk about how great you are, and they want me to break some new piece of information, something insidery, and they want me to do it in 7 minutes. He said it takes me 7 minutes to clear my throat. So I sent them 17. The ACLU of Oregon edited it down to 10. And you heard what was edited out. When he was praising me, he said, as I said before. Let me tell you one more story about Glenn, and I can say this because some of this was published in a book put out by The Guardian last month, but not all of it. When Glenn was in Hong Kong in June, but before The Guardian had published the first story with Ed Snowden's revelations, Glenn is a very impatient civil libertarian and journalist, and was getting frustrated with The Guardian's delays in publishing the first story. And he called me in my office in New York. I didn't know who Snowden was yet. And he said, I'm calling because I need you to advise me not to do something. I'm feeling like I need to publish these stories by myself and not wait for The Guardian because they're being slow. And you're the person who's going to advise me that that's a really bad idea. And I said, you're right. I think that's a really bad idea. I don't think it's so smart legally, but I especially don't think it's smart strategically. If the story that you have is as big as you say it is, and I hadn't seen the story yet, then it could be a really big deal, and we need to make sure that this story is on Meet the Press, not just Democracy Now! Nothing against Democracy Now! We love Democracy Now! After Glenn was on Meet the Press for the first time, a few months later, he called me up and said, thanks, I made it, I got on Meet the Press. Since then, I've also had a chance to be on Meet the Press because of the work that Glenn has done. So it's been quite an extraordinary year. And I will say that we have both also done Democracy Now! If you were going to sum up the revelations of the last 8 months in a single sentence, it would be hard to do, but one possibility would be that we've learned that surveillance technologies have outpaced democratic controls. Now, even before Ed Snowden got on a plane from Hawaii and changed the world, some of us knew that. We knew that tracking technologies had fundamentally changed our lives and altered our lives. It used to be possible to live lives of what you might call practical obscurity. Most of our activities were unobserved and unrecorded, except by the people around us. And consider some basic technologies. I suspect there are people in this room who used to use telephones, or maybe still do, that were connected by cords to a wall. And even those who might have gone into a booth on the street and closed the door to have that kind of conversation. Last year, a very smart article in the New York Times said we should stop calling these things phones, the things that we carry around in our pockets. Phone is the least of what they are. We should call them something else. How about trackers? Some people in my office call them the little policemen in your pocket. These things are communicating all the time with cell phone towers. They are broadcasting your location. Some of them even have satellite GPS connections. Your location says a lot about you. In the words of one federal court, your location data can reveal whether a person is a weekly churchgoer, a heavy drinker, a regular at the gym, an unfaithful husband, an outpatient receiving medical treatment, an associate of particular individuals or political groups. and not just one fact about a person, but all of such facts. This is data that never really existed before. And of course, it's of great interest to the government. And we knew this even before Ed Snowden. We knew that the police were making millions of requests every year to the phone companies to get this kind of information about their customers. And it's not just your location information. This thing in your pocket is a kind of computer that carries around with it some of the most sensitive information about you. Police around the country, in the course of arresting people, have been seizing these phones and emptying the data on them without a warrant, just taking that. Now that issue is going to be in the United States Supreme Court in the next year, and the ACLU will be involved in it. But this is an indication of how much technology has changed the way we live. Think about something like mail, where, again, I remember sending postcards home from summer camp and actually licking envelopes and putting stamps on letters. We now live in a world where really nothing is permanently deleted, but it's stored in a digital cloud. And if you want to understand what the consequences of this digital storage can be, ask Professor David Petraeus of the City University of New York. He was the director of the CIA. One woman sent a nasty anonymous email to another. Before you knew it, the FBI was going through thousands of emails and learned about his extramarital affair. That's the director of the CIA we're talking about. One would think intuitively that we should have the same kinds of legal protections for email that we had for ordinary mail. That is not now the case, and we'll come back to that. Simple activities that we do every day, like shopping. Remember what it was like to browse in a record store when those existed. In a bookstore, you still have the best one in the country here, but many people don't. Most people do their book shopping online, and there are companies that are recording every page or item that you look at and click on, not just what you purchase, and they're using that to create very valuable consumer profiles. If someone were to follow you around while you were shopping with a clipboard and take notes on everything that you looked at, you would probably call security or the police. But when this happens online, we don't even notice or pay any attention to it at all. One other point about this, what you might call architecture of surveillance that we have created without too much reflection. It used to be very expensive to store large amounts of data. And that meant companies and governments had to make decisions about who to track and what to keep. That's really no longer the case. It used to cost something like $100,000 per gigabyte to store digital information. That cost is now somewhere around 10 cents and on its way, rapidly to zero, which means that, in a year or two, it will cost 2 cents to record the content of any individual's phone calls over the course of an entire year. What that means is that for the first time in human history, it's technologically and financially feasible for governments to record everything that we say and do, our phone conversations, our emails, our movements, and even video. And this is really an important point because I think that one of the things that protected our privacy more than law in the past was cost. The fact that governments had to make resource-based decisions about who they were going to track. Not so anymore. And the director of the NSA, Keith Alexander, who you saw in one of Matt's cartoons a minute ago, his mantra has been, let's collect it all. The authorities will follow. Let's get the data now because we can. Let's store all the records of Americans' phone calls. Let's sit on the backbone of the internet and redirect all that traffic into our storage facilities. Let's siphon off billions and billions of communications. And of course, it's not just governments that are doing this, as we know. It's companies that are mining our data to learn all kinds of things about us, sometimes things that we may not yet know ourselves because of their analytic tools. Many of you will be familiar with the New York Times article about Target, the superstore, which wanted to know, because it was very important for their marketing, which of its customers were pregnant. And it turned out that their mathematicians were able to figure this out without a huge amount of difficulty. It involved certain products, unscented lotions, vitamins, cotton balls. I didn't know that. And Target began sending ads and coupons that were directed at people who were pregnant. The father of a teenage girl complained very loudly to Target that this material was being marketed at his daughter, and then a few weeks later apologized to Target for his complaint because they had known what was going on in his household before he did. So what did Target do? They didn't stop doing this. They just decided they had to hide their knowledge, and they had to be more careful about how they sent those advertisements. And so now the diaper advertisement will be next to a lawnmower advertisement. It will be there, but you won't know that you're being tracked in the same way. And this all may sound relatively harmless in comparison to some of the other issues that we work on, but you can be quite sure that companies like Target know, and much less reputable companies, data brokers who buy and sell this information, they know your mental health status, they know your sexual orientation, they know lots of other sensitive information about you. And it probably should make us uncomfortable that these companies know and are selling to other companies whether we're overweight, whether we're depressed, what our sexual orientation is. People, I think most people, if they looked at it more carefully, would be shocked to know how this information is being collected and distributed with your consent. You have checked those boxes and is now in the hands of hundreds of companies that are trying to turn it into dollars. Here's where I need to be pretty clear. This is not a Luddite polemic. I'm not intending to be anti-technology here. Every one of these technologies that I'm talking about has wonderful uses, things that are incredibly beneficial for society. You know, this smartphone that is a tracker, it's incredibly useful. It prevents you from getting lost. It gives you directions to places. I like EasyPass. You know, yes, it's storing my location, but it's pretty easy not to have to wait in line and pay a toll. Google, which is collecting huge amounts of search information, it can learn very important epidemiological information. It can help prevent diseases from spreading. It might even know some things before the CDC knows because of the kinds of searches that people are running. Even a technology like drones, which we just saw here, which are mostly associated with targeted killing and creepy surveillance, could have beneficial uses. Could be used by human rights organizations in a place like South Sudan. Could be used by news organizations who are trying to film police brutality. You know, these are all technologies that are here to stay. Opting out is not really an option. But we need to know that there is an angel use and a devil use associated with each of these technologies in stark religious terms. You know, that GPS is going to help me not get lost, but it's also going to help somebody's stalker find them. And if we want to prevent the benefits of these technologies from being a kind of devil's bargain, we're going to need the right kind of laws and rules in place that will protect us from the most adverse consequences. And here is where the really bad news part of this presentation begins. But don't worry, because it ends on a note of optimism. But our laws really are woefully inadequate to this new reality. So with respect to companies and corporations collecting this information, unlike every other Western democracy, we don't have a basic privacy law that governs the kinds of data that companies can collect, the kind of transparency or choice that they have to offer to users, how they can or can't use highly sensitive information. It's basically a Wild West. With respect to government and law enforcement access, the main law that protects our electronic privacy, our email privacy, both real-time interception of email and stored email, was enacted in 1986 before there was even a World Wide Web, and has all kinds of arcane distinctions that don't make any sense in the modern world. What about the Constitution? What about the Fourth Amendment? Here, at the federal level at least, although not in every state, the Fourth Amendment also has not kept pace. We have something called the third-party doctrine. The Supreme Court held in a series of very unfortunate cases in the 1970s that if we voluntarily turn over any data to any third party, we have relinquished our constitutional privacy interest in that data. This is the Fourth Amendment doctrine that the NSA is relying on when it sucks up all of the metadata from all of our phone calls and stores it. It says, we have voluntarily given this information to the phone company by virtue of having phones, and therefore the Constitution has nothing to say. about that kind of collection. And when it comes to foreign intelligence surveillance, national security surveillance, the kind of surveillance that goes on in secret, the law, of course, is even worse. We know that the Bush administration decided that whatever minimal rules there were in place were too cumbersome and systematically circumvented the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and conducted massive warrantless wiretapping. But we learned since then, and we've learned even more since Snowden, that even after these surveillance activities were purportedly brought back within the law, that just largely meant bringing them to a secret court and having the court write implausible opinions that essentially said that Congress had authorized this kind of illegal surveillance. And as bad as all of that sounds, I'm afraid that isn't even the worst of it, as we now know. Because when surveillance takes place in secret and is justified on national security grounds, and this really is all of the surveillance that the NSA does, even these inadequate rules that I've just laid out for you can be ignored and are ignored. And this is because of a problem that isn't new, and that is the problem, how do you have oversight of secret programs in a democracy? If you believe, as probably most of us in this room believe, that there is some category of information that the government can legitimately keep secret, that actually creates a problem with democratic self-government, because it means that the government has to do things that not all of us will know about and not all of us can consent to. How have we struck that balance? Well, by constitutional design, Congress and the courts are supposed to step in and conduct the kind of oversight that keeps these secret programs, at least nominally, democratic. In Congress, there are intelligence committees that have higher security clearances, and the rest of the members of Congress have greater compartmentalized access to information about the intelligence committees. But of course, we know that they only get the information that the executive branch chooses to share with them. And more often than not, the members of those committees are not the most skeptical members of Congress, but as Glenn Greenwald said, those who are most loyal to the intelligence community that they're supposed to oversee. One of Matt's cartoons showed General Alexander in his lair. There was a really remarkable profile of him by Shane Harris in Foreign Policy magazine, which told us that General Alexander brought in Hollywood set designers to create his command and control center. And it was modeled after the Starship Enterprise, and the doors open and close with a whoosh when people go in. And he has his captain's chair there, and he has his big data displays in front of him. And you can just imagine the members of Congress being brought in for this kind of digital dog and pony show to see all the incredible toys that General Alexander has created. That's not really oversight. What about the courts? And here I think that it is probably an understatement to say that the courts have been pretty disinclined to get very involved in oversight of national security programs. I spent much of the last 10 years trying to bring law and human rights principles to national security programs, and virtually every time we tried to bring these cases, they were dismissed not because courts deemed them legal, but because the security state successfully argued that we had no right to be in court in the first place, and the courts swallowed those arguments. And so when President Obama, in June of last year, in response to the first articles about the Snowden revelations, said that Americans didn't need to worry about these revelations because the programs that were being disclosed have been blessed by all three branches of government, he was right. He was telling the truth, but that was exactly the problem. And that, more than anything else, explains why Snowden felt that he had no alternative but to do what he did. He had watched as this architecture of surveillance that I described before was being built, some of it in secret, and he had watched as the oversight mechanisms that were intended to provide some kind of democratic control had failed. Now, after the public has been educated about these programs, because Snowden gave information to journalists, and those journalists have published these articles. The same three branches of government that, as President Obama said, had blessed these programs are engaged in a historic reevaluation of the NSA's surveillance practices, and we're virtually certain to see the first new limits on intelligence surveillance since the 1970s. What a difference an informed public can make. So let me just go into a little bit more detail about how the traditional oversight mechanisms failed. When The Guardian, let's start with Congress. When The Guardian revealed in early June that the NSA had been collecting on a daily basis the telephone metadata of virtually every American phone call, many members of Congress, including authors of the Patriot Act provision that was being used to authorize this, expressed shock at this revelation. Now, there's been a lot of debate about whether those members of Congress are being sincere, about whether they really didn't know what was going on, whether they should have known what was going on, whether they were being lied to by the NSA. But it doesn't really matter, because either way, it was a colossal failure of oversight. Either they knew about it and they didn't do anything, or they weren't told about it by the intelligence community, even though the intelligence community purported to be relying on a statute that Congress had passed. Now, I think one of the most notorious congressional oversight failures was crystallized in a moment that all of you will be familiar with, when your own Senator Wyden, in a public hearing, asked the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, whether the NSA collected any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans. And Clapper said, "No, sir, not wittingly." Well, this is obviously a brazen falsehood, and we most often hear it discussed as a lie to Congress. That might not be the most accurate way to describe it. Senator Wyden knew that Clapper was lying. Only the American people didn't know. Congress lacked the courage to correct the record. No one in the administration stepped forward to correct the record. To me, this is the very definition of failed oversight. And Edward Snowden was watching. And what about the federal courts? The court that had blessed the NSA's mass surveillance of Americans is a specialized intelligence court that meets in secret and hears only from the government. Now, it was originally designed as a court that would grant warrants in foreign intelligence cases. And it makes sense for a court like that not to be adversarial, to hear only from one side. But after 9/11, the role of that court expanded without any debate and without any discussion. And a court that had been organized really just to grant warrants started issuing lengthy opinions that evaluated the legality under statute and constitution of surveillance programs. And that is a completely improper role for a court to be playing that hears only from one side, the government. So this judicial review, this judicial blessing, amounted to a secret court upholding a secret program by secretly reinterpreting a federal law that all of us thought meant something else. Now, when the ACLU and others tried to challenge these programs in ordinary federal courts, in open courts, as I said before, the government didn't say that these programs were legal. It said that to the press. What it said to the courts was something else. It said that we didn't have legal standing to pursue these challenges, that we had no evidence that our plaintiffs had been subjected to these surveillance practices, and that we were not permitted to obtain that evidence because it was a state secret, and therefore no one would have standing to challenge these programs. And in a 5-4 decision in 2013, that is what the Supreme Court held in an ACLU case. And Snowden was watching that too. And I'll say now that in one of the first discussions that I had with Edward Snowden, one of his very first questions for me was, do you think that these documents will give you standing to pursue these challenges now? Will you get federal courts to do their job and consider whether these programs are legal? This is something that was front and center in his mind. Now, when critics say that Snowden should not have gone to the press, should not have gone to the Washington Post, should not have gone to the Guardian, but he should have brought his complaints through proper channels, these are the proper channels we're talking about. A Congress that had abdicated its oversight role, and courts that had either secretly rubber-stamped these programs or refused to adjudicate their constitutionality. Now, things have changed quite a bit. After Edward Snowden's act of conscience brought the public into this debate, these failed oversight mechanisms have been instantly revitalized. So far, 2 federal courts have considered whether the NSA's mass call tracking of American citizens is constitutional. One of them, in the case that we brought, ruled against us. Another one, in a case brought by another activist in Washington, D.C., said that the program is probably unconstitutional, but neither one of these courts questioned our standing. They both agreed that the plaintiffs had a right to be in court and that the court's job was to decide on the constitutionality of these programs. This is a remarkable development. More challenges are on the way. If this were the only thing that had happened, it would, in my mind, justify what Snowden did. A newly energized Congress has held dozens of oversight hearings, including public hearings, and is considering on a bipartisan basis the most sweeping intelligence reforms in nearly half a century that would end bulk collection of our data, reform the one-sided FISA process, and other reforms. And even the executive branch, even the president himself, has appointed review panels to look at the NSA's activities. These panels have included former very high levels intelligence officials, including the second in charge of the CIA. And they've concluded that the NSA essentially was out of control, that it had allowed its technological capabilities to dictate its surveillance practices, rather than ensuring that those practices conform to our law and our values. And none of this would have happened without Edward Snowden. So very briefly, what have we learned from the Snowden leaks? At the top level, we've learned that a foreign intelligence agency has been collecting the records of almost every American phone call. We've learned that the NSA has systematically undermined the basic encryption systems that we all rely on, making it impossible for us to know that if our most sensitive banking, medical, financial records are truly private, and critically damaging the businesses that depend on this kind of trust. That overseas, the NSA has replaced targeted surveillance with mass dragnet bulk collection and has swept up billions of records every single day from people who are not suspected of any wrongdoing. We've learned that the NSA has actually hacked into the communications links of major internet companies to siphon off data. And those internet companies are now working hard to improve their encryption mechanisms and to bolster security. We've learned about a whole secret body of law, about secret interpretations of laws that had been passed by Congress and that should have been debated publicly. These disclosures have initiated profound changes already and will lead to profound changes in law, in technology, and in democratic oversight. Now, President Obama said in June, and he said again in January, that although he doesn't approve of these leaks, he believes that this debate that we're having will make us stronger. Now, I think that's absolutely correct. Now, this is a debate that should have happened before and not after the NSA deployed a global dragnet surveillance apparatus, but I happen to think that it's not too late for us to have it now. The most frightening possible outcomes from this mass surveillance are not inevitable. Edward Snowden has emboldened the press, he has energized the public, and he has started a once-in-a-generation debate that I think could lead to very, very significant changes. Now, in a profile in the Washington Post in late December, Edward Snowden said to the Washington Post journalist Bart Gellman, "I believe that my mission has been accomplished. My job was to bring the public into this debate. The public's job is to decide what to do with this information." And I couldn't help but be reminded of a story that may or may not be apocryphal about the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And the story goes that as Benjamin Franklin walked out of the convention, a woman asked him, "Mr. Franklin, what will it be? Will it be a monarchy or will it be a republic?" And his answer was, "A republic, if you can keep it." Meaning, we did our job. We decided that this should be a republic. But that's not a one-time decision. It's a decision that depends on all of you. It's something that doesn't get decided once, but gets decided sometimes more than once in every single generation. It's something that we have to fight for It's something that we at the ACLU have been fighting for every year for almost 100 years now, and it's really an honor to be able to do that and to spend this evening with you. So thank you so much. So I am going to be able to answer some of your questions, and I know that some of you, at last count 3 of you, had written them down on pieces of paper, but before then I think you're going to hear from Jennifer Williamson. So I'll see you all in a minute.